thank you so much for having me. As Kai said, I started out as an anthropologist. An anthropologist, by the way, if you don't know, we study things cross-culturally, so we look all over the world and we compare one culture to another. So I'm going to be doing a bit of that today. And I started out studying completely different things. As Kai said, I started out studying the impacts of tourism on traditional Irish music performances in the west of Ireland. And so death and dying was a topic that came very accidentally to me. I'll get to that in a bit, and how I kind of arrived at death and dying, or it sort of arrived at me, I guess. I've kind of studied a whole bunch of things over the years. I'll give you a general trigger warning here at the beginning. I assume that you're a group of people who are self-selected to be ready to talk about death and dying if you've come to this lecture. So I probably don't need to give you a trigger warning, but I'm going to anyway. I'm going to be showing you some pictures of corpses. So that's going to be there. Sometimes I find my students are fine with that, just given our pop culture, I think, with lots of death and dying in pop culture. But I'm also going to be showing you, and this is what my students sometimes find more disturbing, pictures of animals dying. So sacrificial kind of things with animals. So sometimes I think that's interesting that students sometimes find that worse than people dying. And I will be discussing suicide, so that's a very serious kind of issue. So I want to start, and this might sound odd, but I want to start with a definition, or an attempt at a definition. We tend to think of death as like a light switch. It's on, and then you flip it off, and you're dead. And there's all sorts of things that kind of reinforce this in American culture. So today I'm going to actually be talking about a few other case studies, but also really focusing on American culture. And in American culture, we've been encouraged legally, actually, to think about death as an event, as a moment where it happens, right? And if you think about something, just as one example of that, if you think about something like the fact that we have a public role, a legal public role in society called the coroner, who determines a time of death. I think that's just such a really interesting thing. And by the way, this is not a medical professional. This is an elected position in every county. Sometimes it is a medical professional, but it doesn't have to be. Any one of us could run for coroner. And that person shows up at a hospital or a hospice facility or a car accident and looks at the clock, talks to the EMTs, and says, okay, this person died at this particular moment, and it's down to a minute, and that gets filed away as a kind of legal time of death. That's fascinating to me, because even today, the medical professionals will tell you that it's a process. It's actually a whole process of dying. I had a death doula come to one of my classes last week to talk to my students about this. So she's somebody who's not, she's a midwife of dying people. So she sits with people who are dying, and she talked to the students about, the kind of stages of death. And of course, it depends on a disease. It depends on, the means that somebody is, how they're passing. But there are signs and sort of indicators that, we're getting another step closer, right? But in the 20th century, I'll get into this in a minute, but in the 20th century, we medicalized the process of dying, right? We took it from the home and put it in the hospital system. And hospitals are meant to cure you. So there's a kind of, especially, I'm talking about maybe the 1950s, the 1960s, mid-century, we really leaned into that medicalization of death and thought of it as something to cure, which is, if you think about it, it's kind of patently absurd that you could cure death. But instead of curing death, we started curing all the little symptoms of death, trying as much as we could to kind of prevent this ultimate and inevitable sort of thing that's about to happen, right? But so even today, I think the medical professions now, hospice care is now a really growing kind of thing. Still very expensive and not accessible to a lot of people, but we can kind of now recognize that we should have a different approach to this and a processual approach to this, right? But we've kind of tried to cure all these mini symptoms. And our technology, by the way, has gotten far ahead of our discussions about this. So we have all these situations where, there's discussions in families, our family member is lying there in the hospital and they're brain dead. but the machinery is keeping them going, that causes, a kind of ethical, moral discussion that clearly we're not really ready to have, because a lot of those families are not prepared with do not resuscitate orders or whatever. So we're running into all of these cases where the process of death and our idea of it as a light switch are not kind of matching up and causing all sorts of social and psychological problems for us. So, but then when you get into culture, which is sort of the remit of anthropologists as social scientists, understanding the cultural, the spiritual, the kind of different value systems around the world, things get much, much, much more complex. And the reality is a lot of cultures, not all of them, but a lot of cultures around the world see death not just as a process, but also the fact that there's a biological death that is not the same thing as a social death. So sometimes societies believe that your spirit, your ghost, whatever, lives on in the community with you. I'm going to get to a case study about this. Other times, you might have a social death before your physical death. There might be rituals where it's kind of like a funeral, perhaps, and maybe the community kind of walks past you and you kind of say your final things to them. And they're mourning, they're sad, but after they're done, they walk away. You are dead to them, even though biologically you haven't passed away yet. So these things don't always match up. And I'm not going to show you slides about this, but the fact that social media now, there are dead people online, right? Facebook now has more dead people than living people. It's just demographics. So it's becoming an online cemetery. What do we do with that? Mark Zuckerberg knows what he wants to do with that. He wants to keep those sites going as memorials. And you've probably all seen this. This has happened to me too, where on the anniversary of somebody's death, their feed is filled with, so they're almost speaking to us online after death. So that's a social kind of death that kind of, I don't know, has it happened yet? Is it still ongoing? Even long after the biological death. So I always encourage my students to think about what you want with your social media feeds and other things too. Mm-hmm. So social deaths, biological deaths, kind of different. And you can think of, in some of these cultures where the ancestry lives very close next to you, that the funeral is not as much for the living as it is for the dead. This is a rite of passage into the ancestry. So it's kind of an interesting way of kind of rethinking about what rituals around death are all about. Well, the fact is that in American society, we have what is called a death denial culture. We, in fact, once you start looking cross-culturally, you begin to realize pretty quickly that it's Americans that are the outliers, actually. So we don't have a very good, healthy psychological relationship with death. A lot of our ritual and funerary practices are meant to prevent us from thinking about death at all, right? If you go to a funeral home, I've heard funeral directors say this, or I've heard relatives say this to funeral directors, they look so lifelike. Like that's a compliment, right? To a funeral, like you did such a great job with my mom or whatever. Why do we want them to look alive when it's a funeral, right? That's an interesting psychological sort of move. And then, if we think about embalming, you put the embalmed body in a casket, you seal the casket, you put that in a vault in the ground. There's a kind of pushing away of the process of decomposition in our heads. We don't want to think about it. So this has become a very prominent part of American psychology around death and dying, and it's big business, right? The death industry is a very profitable one, into the billions of dollars annually. So, part of our death denial is spending a lot of money on this particular ritual because we don't want to think about it, right? So it wasn't always this way in the West. So if you roll the clock back even a few hundred years, European and American societies were much more comfortable with the idea of death. There's this Latin phrase, memento mori, remember you will die. And that was something that people said. It's actually inscribed on colonial American headstones. If you go to European cathedrals, you see those old headstones with like a skull and crossbones on it. It might say memento mori. That was meant for the living to walk through these cemeteries and really contemplate their own deaths, right? So, and you see these ossuaries and the crypts in places like France or Palermo in this case, and paintings like this that were meant to get you to contemplate death. So we weren't always so uncomfortable with it in Western cultures either. There's a whole history to why this is the case. Here's another example. Why do we call it a funeral parlor? It's called a funeral parlor because the parlor for the dead was in your home until not too long ago. This is like Victorian times. So you look around the Broadway district here in these kind of old Victorian homes, you had the front room, which was the public-facing part of your house where the family would invite neighbors and friends and relatives in. That is where you died upstairs in the bedroom, and that is where the body was displayed. So we eventually industrialized that, we medicalized it, we pushed it out of the home and into a funeral parlor, right? So that even the language there kind of remains from when we were much more comfortable with it. So it wasn't always this way. Again, our technology often gets ahead of us. So these are photos, kind of memento mori photos from the early days of photography, when, photography was expensive at the time, and maybe you had a family portrait, but maybe you couldn't afford it, and your daughter dies. So this was your one opportunity to have that photo before you buried the daughter. Now, I think to modern aesthetic sensibilities, I've shown this photo again in classes before, and students are a little like, there's a kind of creepiness to kind of propping up this young man in his little, these guys with the straw hats with sticks and whatever, right? Our technology gets ahead of us before we can kind of discuss, what we want, really. So this is a good example of that kind of situation, right? So what happened? How did all this happen? A lot of people who study this history talk about the Civil War in America for a couple of reasons. One, this photo on the right is a soldier. And you can think of all the young men that were mustered in northern Illinois, for example, being sent down to Shiloh or something like that, right? They were sent off on trains and buggies and horses and marching. They're far away at a time when it was hard to, transport was not easy. And they were just gunned down, slaughtered in those battles. And so there was a real issue about getting the bodies back to the families in a place like northern Illinois. How do you do it? So, some clever people realized that using formaldehyde and horrible toxic things like arsenic and, some chemical methods, you could preserve that body long enough to get it back home on the train, so you could have that closure with the family. So embalming was a thing. You drain the fluids out of the body and you fill it with these chemicals to at least get it back. But then Lincoln himself, famously, his young boy, I think he was only 10 or 11 years old, when his son, and apparently they were just very open about it, this was their favorite son, died, I think, of yellow fever or something like that. He was just devastated. So in the middle of the Civil War, he also had the loss of his son, and he couldn't take it. I mean, he was broken by this. So he was like, embalm my son, right? So he had his son embalmed. And then when he was assassinated, they embalmed him and they put him on tour. So that picture on the left is Lincoln on his final tour of America as an embalmed body. So the American people could say their goodbyes. And this, it was one of those moments in history where it's like, if that's good enough for Lincoln, it's good enough for me. So this became like I don't want to say trendy, but this became the popularized way of dealing with the body in American society. This is a very particularly American way of dealing with the dead body. And like I said, it's become big business. I'm not going to go through these numbers here, but you can just kind of glance at this and realize that, it's a not only a big business, but a growing big business, right? There's a lot of money to be made and I had a funeral director come in and talk to me from this industry, talk to my students just on Tuesday. And even she was like, we're kind of encouraged. Like, we go to funeral director conferences and stuff like that. We talk about all this stuff, Of course there's discussions about the finances of all of our businesses and how to upsell people, in these moments when they're kind of in this grieving sort of crisis. We have to find a way. For example, embalming today is on the decline. Cremation has now well overtaken embalming. Well, it's not a cheap process, but it's certainly less expensive. So the industry, is like, how do we make up for that loss in revenue? So there's a business model here, right? So that's something we should all kind of be very well aware of in terms of what we want. And hopefully a talk like this can give you, if you haven't been prompted to think about what you want, maybe we all should talk about that. So anyway, this became such a foregone conclusion that it was almost like an academic industry by the mid-century. By the 60s and 70s, people are cranking out books about, in psychology and sociology and anthropology about this culture of death denial. And, it's still very much pervasive today. But this had become kind of a foregone conclusion that this is the American way of death. But the flip side of death denial, I think, is reveling in the deaths of others. So this is where we come back to pop culture. If you think about just the amount of death we consume as entertainment, I think that is the flip side of the coin of not wanting to think about our own death and decay or the death and decay of our friends and relatives, right? Push that away, but consume the pop culture version. And we even have, you think about all these genres. The war movie is just a classic genre for lots of reasons, some of which are kind of reveling almost in what a colleague of mine calls a pornography of death. So kind of a, real focus on it. But I also think like zombies, vampires, these are the dead, right? That we're kind of reveling in. I always think it's interesting that zombies are gross, but vampires are, kind of sexy or something. There's a weird, what's going on there? I don't know. I think we need a psychologist to look into that. But then there's also this genre of post-apocalypticism. Is that a word I just made up? This whole kind of genre about the death of society in general, right? Which as an anthropologist, I'm obsessed with, because I'm like, what would people do to create a new society? It's always interesting to me. But yeah, I think this is kind of the flip side of that coin. So let me take you to another part of the world. This is in Indonesia. This is the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And on the island of Sulawesi, there's three major ethnic groups, one of which is called the Tanah Toraja people. They build these beautiful traditional structures. These are their houses if they live in a traditional village. And I think you'll agree that this is what we might call a death-positive culture. If we are a death-denying culture, this is a culture that very much leans into it. And so just really briefly, this is today, if you went to Sulawesi and you talked to Tanah Toraja people, and you said, what's your religion? They would say, almost all of them, 9 out of 10 would say, I'm a Christian. I'm a Protestant Christian. That's because for over 100 years, Protestant missionaries have been going there. And right away, the Protestant missionaries looked at their funerary practices and said, I don't think so, this is horrible, what are you doing? And I'll show you why in a minute. But they realized it was so embedded in their culture that there was no kind of eliminating it. So they said, fine, we'll take our losses. As long as you convert and go to church and you take communion, you can keep your practices. So this is what we call a syncretic religion, which is the fancy word for a blended religion. So on the surface, this is Protestant Christian, but if you look at what people are doing, it's very, very traditional. So they believe, and even as Christians, they believe their ancestors do not go off somewhere, right? This is the kind of Western belief. At best, grandma's looking down at me from on high or something, right? But she's far away. There's a proximity there. Here, in cultures like this, we sometimes call it ancestor worship, which is not really a good description. But they just believe that the ancestors, the ghosts or spirits, live with you right here in town. And you have to take care of them. You still have a relationship with them. There's a kind of warmth in that, right? This is where sacrifices come in. You need to give them gifts of food and cigarettes. They're heavy smokers in Sulawesi. So you're constantly leaving cigarettes for them and coffee and all sorts of stuff. Because they're right here, right now. So what they do, because of that belief system, is when somebody dies, they lay the body out. So on the upper right-hand corner there, you see how they've laid this body out in the living room, in one of the rooms in the house. And they start introducing the idea to their relative that they're dead. Actually, so every morning they'll go in, present the relative with a cup of coffee, and you have your cup of coffee, and you light a cigarette, put it in an ashtray next to them, you have a cigarette with them, you're talking to them, and you're like, gosh, you're looking a little tired today, right? You're not looking yourself. Right? And slowly, because this is traumatic for the dead person to be introduced to the idea that they're dead. Right? Slowly you kind of, introduce, maybe over the course of a year, maybe 2 years, maybe this body is in your house for 6, 7, 8 years. Kids are playing. Kids who grow up in this society are like, yeah, I remember when my grandpa died, and yeah, that was the room we'd play, cars in and whatever. And they're treating the body. They know what they're doing, right? In the West, part of our death denial is to think that dead bodies are disease vectors from the moment of death. It's polluting, it's awful, get rid of it, let a medical professional take it away. They know what they're doing. In the old days, they would use herbal remedies to kind of clean it up, clean the fluids out, and help preserve the skin. They slowly mummify over time. So after a year, you're gonna have a mummified body. Today, they sometimes do biochemical, like formaldehyde and things like that, and paint the skin, and they're cleaning it up and they're redressing the ancestor. So they live with the dead, and eventually there's a kind of a mid ceremony between the death and the funeral, which might be 7 or 8 years later, called the menene, when they dress the body up, and now it's completely stiff, and there's just skin left. It's totally mummified, as you can see on the left. And they walk the body across the village to a charnel house where they store all the bodies. And occasionally there'll be a ceremony every couple of years where they bring the bodies out, and you could see grandma again, and you talk to her. I'm like, oh God, it's so good to see you. Right? She's not gone. She's right there with you. So very different belief system about what happens to you when you die. Eventually you're just kind of left with bones, and you bundle those bones up, and outside of every village and town, there's a cliff wall. You build these alcoves into them. You have a local artisan make you a tau, which is an effigy of your ancestor. That is where your ancestor's spirit lives, in this effigy. So it's not a representation of your ancestor. That is grandma in that case. So this is where you leave a lot of the sacrifices, of cigarettes and money and all sorts of stuff. So at the funeral then, there's a major sacrificial thing that happens. If you're wealthy enough, not every family is wealthy enough to do this, but you might purchase a lot of water buffalo, a lot of chickens, a lot of pigs, and you sacrifice them in a massive, big, multi-day ceremony that's bloody, as you can see. There's a lot of guts and gore here, and this is a gift to that particular ancestor. Maybe there's a group. It's a kind of group funeral. And you have a huge feast. Of course, the humans get to eat the water buffalo and the chickens, right? We get the flesh. So you have a big feast. But the ancestor gets the spirit of the water buffalo in a way. So to a Western sensibility, again, this looks very strange. This looks bloody. This looks gory. But I want you to think about how this is a warm, loving embrace of their ancestors, right? They would look at our funeral practices and be like, it's so cold, you're not only preserving the body, but why? You're just shoving it in the ground, right? That's how they would kind of judge American funeral practices, right? So we kind of have to see this as its own kind of beautiful thing. Contemporary issue, which is really interesting, is that Western tourists who are kind of fascinated by this practice, they hear about it and they want to go see it. I thought it was interesting. A friend of mine, Kathleen Adams, has done field work with the Tamataraja since the mid-'80s, so for many decades. And when she told me about this tourism, I said, that's horrible. People going to gawk And there is some of that. She said, yes. But the Tana Toraja people have mixed feelings about this because they don't like the gawking tourists who are there to kind of make fun of them. But the respectful tourists, they're like, oh, let us help you. Like you clearly, these are mostly European, American, Australian tourists. They're like, you all have an issue. Like you could come see our funerals and see how, maybe you don't want to imitate it, but you could see how it could be better for you, right? So they almost feel like there's an educational mission that they have by inviting tourists to their ceremonies. Okay, let's see, what is my time here, Kai?
You are doing fine, it's about 2:35.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna briefly show you some slides of how I came around. I said this was accidental for me. I was studying traditional musicians in the pubs in the west of Ireland in a little village called Doolin, hanging out with them, super fun, light work, ethnomusicology, studying tourism and why people were there on holiday. And there's some like social economic issues there, but nothing as serious as death. But what happened was in this little village just south of the village is this really dramatic landscape that you're seeing here called the Cliffs of Moher. And it's a big tourist site. It's one of the most popular, maybe some of you have been there. It's a very popular tourist site. Over 1 million tourists go there every year. To put that in context, 5 million people live in the Republic of Ireland, so it's a lot of tourists who go there, right? It's a beautiful landscape. You can see how big it is. First of all, if you go there, don't do what these people are doing, standing right at the edge, especially when the weather's bad like that. The wind can sweep up and suck you right off. So people die there. You can see how big it is though. If you look at the far cliffs, there are people standing up at the top. That's how big these cliffs are. Okay, so these cliffs were there, and what I started hearing kind of in the pubs, as I got to know people, there's a local Coast Guard unit that has to run out of Doolin. It's all volunteer. If somebody dies at the cliffs, they're the ones who have to collect the body. So whether that's accidental or by suicide. And the reality is this has become a suicide black spot. People have traveled there to commit suicide. It's a final destination. There's no coming back from that fall. It will break the body. So, but what tourists do, and this has led me to my study, I started hearing about this, that accidental death, suicidal death, tourists and the people who run the interpretive center at the Cliffs of Moher will say it is mostly Americans who are engaging in a lot of these practices, are taking kind of great risks sometimes. I love this photo on the right. It was one of my first and favorite fieldwork photos of these, kind of suburban mom-looking women like hopping this danger sign to go do something that is actually pretty risky. And then this guy, I was walking out there to kind of talk to people, like, why are you out here? And I love that he's got like an evolution thing on his sweatshirt. I didn't notice that until later. But I was talking to him and I was like, so why are you out here? He's like, it's so beautiful. I wanted to come right to the edge. And I mentioned, he was like, why are you asking? And I was like, well, I'm doing a study. People die here. And he had no idea. He kind of slowly backed away from the edge, kind of scared. He just didn't really think about it, right? So a lot of people are engaging in this kind of activity. And I think a site like that, a couple of you have been there, it is, or if you've been to the Grand Canyon or something like that, it is awesome in the original definition of that word. It inspires awe. And I think there is something kind of compulsive about wanting to go to the edge. I understand it. I felt it myself. And it makes you think about the big questions because it's stone, sea, sky, that's it, right? So I think one of the things that it also does psychologically, it's sort of like the pop culture side of the coin. It makes us kind of laugh uncomfortably. And so there's all these kind of genres of photography that people engage in that's kind of joking about death at the cliffs, right? So you see a lot of people kind of taking these mock photos of themselves falling. The idea is you find a place where, there's a little kind of divot on the edge. You can kind of crawl down there and sort of make it look like you're falling, like this woman on the right? So people are kind of, I think psychologically, I have to joke about it. And there's like I think this is a common thing. You see pictures like this all over the place where people are pretending to jump and you think, wow, like people actually do jump here. I hope they don't know that when they're making fun of it, but kind of a macabre sort of sense of humor. And the Interpretive Center got so tired of people stealing the "do not cross this barrier" signs as souvenirs. Like, they can't keep up. There's so many tourists that will peel that thing off. They just went ahead and made t-shirts with that on it. So they're kind of cashing in on this sort of, what is, I guess, in some people's minds, sort of lighthearted kind of joking about it, right? But this is the reality. This is another early fieldwork photo I took. I didn't really know what I was taking a photograph of at the time. This is a woman over here on the left taking a photo of a bunch of guys in jumpsuits looking over they're the Coast Guard unit. They're looking at a body at the bottom of the cliffs, right? This is the reality of what happens. That's, by the way, the only safe way to get to the edge, is to belly crawl, because that wind can kind of pull you right off. So yeah, they were looking to see if the waves were bad enough still that they could get the boat in close enough to the edge of the cliff to collect the body. So that is the reality there. It's not a common occurrence, by the way. I always get that question. And people don't keep numbers for, I think, reasons of dignity. They don't publish numbers every year. But there are some years where nobody dies at the cliffs at all, and other years when it's like 10, 11, 12. So, this isn't like hundreds of people or something, but it's a tragic kind of place in that sense. So people go there on holiday. This is what ended up kind of being the impetus for the book that I ended up writing about it. It's called Leisure and Death. So it's all like these juxtapositions between our leisure practices and death and dying, because people don't go there to confront death. They're on holiday. But then you get there and you see the cliff edge, you see suicide hotline numbers, you see memorials to people who have died, and suddenly you're confronted with death while having a leisurely experience, right? So that is the accidental thing that led me to kind of contemplate all of this in the first place. Now, I think this is kind of the situation we're living with now, this sort of death denial. I think there are models out there, cultural models, we could look to. Okay, I don't want a Tana Taraja funeral. That is not in my advance directive, to have a bunch of water buffalo sacrificed and to be laid out in my house for 7 years, okay? But I think we could look to other societies to kind of have other types of discussions to become more death positive. And this is a mortician. I brought one of her books that I'm actually teaching right now, named Caitlin Doty. She's from California. She's one of many people who are arguing, I guess I'm arguing for it today too, that we should become more death positive. We should kind of have a more loving, warm embrace of our own deaths, of the death of our loved ones. And so she's been trying to push things like a death cafe. I was saying to somebody before here, we might be hosting a death cafe at Augustana this spring. This is a British tradition that's come over to the United States. You always have tea and sweets because it's British, and then you have a discussion, a kind of led discussion about our own deaths. Just to kind of let's kind of get over this I don't want to talk about it thing. So kind of reclaiming memento mori. Really kind of thinking about what we want. And maybe you do want your Facebook page to become the memorial site, but maybe you don't. Maybe we should just at least have a conversation about it. Maybe you don't want Zuckerberg making money off you even after you're gone, because that's what he wants. So we should kind of take more control of all of those aspects of our deaths and think about things like, if you want, maybe you do want to be embalmed. Great. Maybe you do want a cremation. By the way, cremation usually costs about $7,000 or $8,000 and uses about as much fuel as it would take to drive from the Quad Cities to California. So there's if you want to think about fuel expenditure, I don't know, your carbon footprint, you can be buried in a green kind of fashion. There's lots of versions of this. Human composting, for example, is a thing I can talk about more. Being wrapped in muslin, and you can't go 6 feet down, so this has become a regulatory problem in a lot of states. State by state, there's different regulations. In the state of Iowa, it's by law, you have to be buried 6 feet under. But your body will not decompose quickly if it's 6 feet under. 3 feet or less, that allows for, you know, all of our insect friends to kind of do their business, right? There's even experiments being done. There's a kind of a body farm in North Carolina where they do forensic anthropology and they kind of study the way bodies kind of decompose. But they're also doing experiments for volunteers who donate their body to this science of mulching the body. Like above ground, you kind of create a big, huge pile of mulch. Apparently even cadaver dogs, if you do it right, and they're trying to figure this out right now, cadaver dogs will walk right past it. Because it's, you know, if you have a compost pile in your garden, if it stinks, it's not going well. Like, it shouldn't actually smell bad. It should smell like earth. So they're figuring out other green ways to have burials, right? We don't just have one option in the United States. We should have more. So we should just kind of think about our own way of dying and what we want. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to have questions or comments from you all. Yes?
Yeah, is there any cross-cultural significance to Irish pubs and Irish wakes? Or are they just reciprocal of each other?
I thought a lot over the years about the Irish kind of psychology of death, and in some ways the Irish are incredibly death positive. They have wakes. I went to a wake that lasted 3 days, and that was not an embalmed body. That was a very prominent member of this village I lived in. And there were just so many people coming. He was so prominent that people came from Australia and they couldn't make it right away. They waked him for 3 days. And then the whole village, all the mirrors were covered in shrouds and doors were closed as he made his way to the cemetery. And you went to that wake, and this is not uncommon. I mean, the front room, that's where the body is, the immediate family sitting around, and you go around and shake hands, and you say kind of, you know, whispered condolences. And then you're shuffled into the kitchen where it's a party. I mean, like, there's Guinness and whiskey, there's musicians, you know, sitting at the kitchen table. I mean, and people are telling stories about that person. It's a fun time, actually. They love their funerals, right? They love thinking about death and dying. The exception is suicide. So, you know, because it's a prominently Catholic country, that was not just a mortal sin. In Ireland until the 1990s, it was illegal to commit suicide, actually. So the family was punished, actually, if you committed suicide. So, and in fact, coroners there, because it's so stigmatized, call it death by misadventure. That's how it's put on there, so it's not, you know, a suicide. So to kind of help the family out in a way. So in some ways, very death positive with that one exception, for sure. Yeah.
I heard somewhere, I guess I read it somewhere, the Eskimos, like old grandma or grandpa, and they're coming to the checkout lane, will leave.
Yeah.
And just disappear.
Yeah. Yeah, so suicide is not stigmatized in lots of cultures around the world, actually, right? It's very stigmatized in the United States, I think, and other Western cultures. But yeah, the Eskimo, that is a beautiful, graceful gesture to your family, right? You know, famously, like the Japanese, the sort of traditional Japanese culture, committing, you know, suicide is a way to recapture honor for your family if you shamed them somehow or let them down, right? And that's not that unusual around the world, to think of it as a beautiful gesture, not something to be ashamed of. Also, we just have the Northern Lights. The Inuit people and the Yupik people, who we often call Eskimo, they believe that's where the dead are. They're dancing. It's the dance hall of the dead. It's kind of a nice idea. So, yeah. Yeah, Con?
I've been tracking legislation on green burial.
Yeah.
And right now, there's only about 6 states that really permit the kind of composting that you're talking about. Legislation's been introduced in Illinois. It hasn't made it to full consideration yet. And interestingly, one of the chief opponents of the legislation is the Catholic Cardinal of Chicago. What is it about Catholicism that doesn't like the idea of a green burial?
I mean, that's a great idea, or a great question. I don't actually know, but I also know that the Catholic Church has historically in this country been really against cremation too, which is interesting because if embalming is okay, I mean, and you think about this whole history of embalming, it's just recent. I mean, it's not And there's certainly nothing natural about it. I mean, so I think it's the idea of change, you know? And they don't do this in Europe. I mean, you get 40 or 50 years in a European cemetery, and then, you know, there's just too many dead people in Europe. I mean, so they clean out you kind of rent it for 40 or 50 years, and then, you know, you're put into one of these kind of bigger charnel houses. So, you know, the expectation is that this preserved body sitting in a cemetery in a vault that's embalmed for centuries or something, which is not what happens, by the way, to the body in the casket. It does eventually decompose into a chemical kind of soupy mess. Actually, it's really sad. So, and cemeteries, for that reason, the vault is there to keep the chemicals in.
Yeah.
But that also fails after a while. So, like, I hope none of you live downstream from a cemetery in the United States, because they're testing the water constantly. If there's a stream that runs through a cemetery, those are usually incredibly polluted because there's like arsenic in it. Like if it's an old embalmed body, they don't use arsenic anymore, but like I don't want formaldehyde in my water system. So like, yeah, these are not kind of healthy environments as a result. So I don't know what the resistance is to a more natural kind of decomposition. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I've told my family I'd like a Viking funeral, but they all said no. Why do you think cremation has become more popular in the last, I would say even 10 years in the United States?
Yeah, 10, 15, 20 years, it's just skyrocketed. I think I think there is a kind of recognition that maybe embalming isn't for me. I mean, it might be for some people, but you know, clearly a lot of people are walking away from that as a method. And I think there's an assumption that cremation is, you know, kind of more natural or something. The sad reality is, like Caitlin Doty writes about this in this book and other books, you know, a cremation facility is usually in a very industrial part of town because people don't want it in their neighborhood. And it's a very industrial looking place. And actually, she's like, we could do cremation better too. You know, we could have a more kind of ritualized family way of doing it. There's a community in Creosote, Colorado. It's the only community that they have gotten the Colorado legislature to allow them to do this. They have funeral pyres. So you're talking about a Viking funeral. There's a kind of mortician funeral home, whatever there, that the friends and family will gather at dawn or something. And there's an open sky funeral pyre that they know how to make a fire. And that this, you know, they watch the body disintegrate and melt away. And then somebody takes a staff, a metal rod, cracks the skull open. Yep, because it has to happen as part of that process. The brains kind of leak out and that gets consumed as well. Some of the fires get so hot there's almost no bone left, but even at that point, you can kind of gather the bones. And like, that can be a really beautiful, everybody puts a pine bough down on the body or something, I don't know. But they had to fight for that, like tooth and nail for years to get that to be allowed. And you can't have that done. You can't just call them up and say, hey, I want that done. You have to be from that community. So like, there's a lot of resistance to any sort of alternative ways of doing this. Like, I'd rather have that done than a kind of industrial thing that really separates you from your family. Like, the family isn't gonna go to that cremation facility and watch this huge industrial metal tube container and you put the body in there and light it up, you know, like that's not a very warm thing either, right? So I want the Viking funeral too, yeah. Yeah.
The impact of the pandemic on
Yes.
just funeral business and just how people who lost people during the pandemic, you know, I don't know if you've done studies on that or kind of reviewed that literature. How did we cope with that? How are people helping us deal with that? Because still, it's 5 years later,
Yeah.
we're still kind of stuck.
I mean, I think it's probably a really good example of death denial. I mean, and I think a lot of families, unfortunately, haven't really ritualized those deaths. I mean, they were allowed to go into hospitals as they're, you know, you have like a final phone call. I just can't imagine the tragedy of that. And then so many people were dying in places like New York City that, you know, there were cooling trailers for the bodies. And the state in that case was funding lots of cremations. I mean, they were doing it, without. I mean, they had to do it quickly, so they weren't really having a lot of consultation with families. So there was a real kind of pushing away of death there too, and the fact that we haven't really dealt with it, I don't think we've really wrapped our heads around what happened 5 years ago. Yeah, I think there's a bit of death denial in that too, in that instinct to not even want to approach it. Yeah, really. Yeah, very good point. Yeah.
In America, I mean, we obviously have a problem with aging in general.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if that's related to, just the reality we are gonna die, but I was wondering if, I don't know how to state it, just kind of went out of my head too, that do these other cultures, I know they don't have the medical systems that we do. Do they try to stop death as much as Americans do? Like, the treatments can be worse than the dying?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that is a not uniquely American thing, but we tend to be we've gotten pretty bad about that actually, of really trying to stop the dying process in a way that a lot of other cultures, you mentioned the Eskimo cultures, they're like, I guess it's my time, and that's okay because I'm becoming an ancestor. I think that's part of it. I think also culturally, we are a youth culture. We're obsessed with youth in every way. These cultures that have these beliefs about ancestors, my God, they also revere their elders. I mean, those are the first people in line. They would look at our kind of putting mom in a home kind of thing, and they'd be pretty judgy about that, I think, right? So there's a kind of reverence for your elders in those societies too that I think has been reversed in America for better or worse. It is what it is, but I think it's feeding into some of that, and then it carries over into death. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about the funeral pyre, because in India we do that.
Yes.
So yeah, and it's also, I think it's said that the ash, it helps clean the river. It has some properties which helps, because we also put the ashes in the river after the cremation is done. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. And also there is a word called sannyas, which is like people leave their bodies, they willingly, they would just leave their bodies and they would take a sannyas. And basically, it said the soul has just left the body.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, funeral pyres are not unusual. There's so many practices around the world that we could look to. But again, maybe not all of them are ones you want. I'm not going to have the water buffalo sacrifice, but maybe there's some practices we could look at and think, actually, maybe we should legalize that. It's so interesting how one of my students made a comment today after I introduced them to their advanced directives and power of attorney, and one of them said, I didn't realize dying was so complicated. I was like, that's really interesting. You put it that way, because it legally, oh wow, it really is. It's not simple.
What about the whole thing now with cremation, about taking your loved one's ashes and distributing them to special places and sprinkle, some places they've regulated that you can't put ashes there anymore. It's gotten so popular, but is that just an American thing, or is that something that?
No, I mean, there is an American version of that. Like the national park system has to really kind of police this. Like a lot of people bring stuff to national parks or Wrigley Field or whatever. People are bringing little Ziploc bags and, I mean, and they get away with it, and maybe we should be open to that. I don't know. But the idea of dispersing your loved ones is a really ancient thing. A lot of Native American tribes, not all of them, but some of them would have sky burials. The Zoroastrian tradition is a sky burial. So you'd, you put the body, you kind of bundle it up, but you kind of put it in a tree, or you build a platform and you let the buzzards come. And that's seen as a beautiful thing. It's distributed through the ecosystem, right? That idea of kind of sending your ancestors off into the natural world, And if that's in the form of ashes in a Ziploc bag. It's not that different, really. Yeah, yeah.
So I wrote an article recently about, in Canada, the medical aid in dying directives that they
Oh,
have,
yeah.
and how they're getting concerned that too many people are asking to die, to be put to death, even though they may not be terminally ill. And it said, they think there are too many. I'm just curious what you think about that.
I mean, I think that falls back into our technology. We're able to do certain things that we're not ready to have the discussion about, right? So, like, I think the Canadians are having that discussion. There's a hospital facility, I don't even know if you'd call it that, in the Netherlands called Dignitas. And that's a place where people, you sign up, you kind of apply for this, but like, I've got terminal cancer, I want to go and end my life, and they will help you do that, right? So there are models for that around the world in a medicalized, highly developed medical system. I think what Canada is going through right now is the discussion about it, right? Because, yeah, if there are too many people kind of applying for this for the wrong reasons, I don't know, let's have that conversation, right? Yeah, so I think it kind of taps back into that. Like, we often think technology is good for its own sake without really thinking about it, right? So we should have the discussions first. That'd be ideal. We don't tend to do that, though.
We don't do that.
Kirsten Day, Dr. Day.
Earlier in your talk, you talked about the rituals concerning a social death.
Yes.
Where they would have a death and then they'd be dead, but they'd still. So that is just curious to me also. Can you talk a little bit more about it? Like, where does the person go and why would they participate in this? What's the point of it?
I mean, it's saying goodbye, and I don't think it's terribly common, but I'm thinking there's I forget which tribe it is. There's an Amazonian tribe that does that. So it might be the Yanomama. I'd have to look it up. But yeah, they have this kind of rich part. It's like a pre-funeral, where you're kind of going to have your final conversation with them. And apparently, like, people are crying and like they're kind of in this line, and then they walk away and they're kind of wiping their, like there's a part of the death that's happening there. It's the social part, right? And then the family takes care of it as it, happens biologically or whatever.
So it usually precedes what an expected death.
Yeah, somebody's dying. Yeah,
I
it's inevitable.
was confused and thought it maybe meant like they're being ostracized sort of or something. No.
I mean, in some ways, I suppose it would make me feel ostracized, but not them, but they're becoming an ancestor, so they're like, okay, this is this first step of separation from the living, and I'm walking into the ancestral realm. So maybe I don't know, but maybe I'm speculating, but maybe psychologically that's okay with them. I don't know.
Well, friends, before we go any further, would you join me in thanking Dr. Adam Kaul again? Thank you. And